Hi, my name is Sheila from Seaside Snuggles Quilts, Patterns, and Crafts, where I focus mainly on quilts, but will make any craft that tickles my fancy. So today we're going to talk about how I went from not even this, but a sketch in my notepad to this center medallion. So I made a video where I made these blocks, which is a free pattern, and I'll link that down below and also maybe in the cards if I can figure that out. And I decided to make a medallion center and then surround it with these blocks. Now, I sketched it in my notepad, and I'll put a picture of that up. And then from there, I drafted a pattern, and then from the drafted pattern, I made all the pieces, cut them to size, put them together, and ended up with this gorgeous medallion that I'm very proud of. This video is showing you that process. This is not available as a pattern. I don't know if I'm going to make it available as a pattern. If I do, it will be in the store, not a free pattern. But from this video, you'll be able to take the steps needed to draft your own medallions in whatever design you choose. So I will talk you through some tips and tricks and show you how I went from here to here. One other thing, I made this medallion using these fabrics to match the blocks that I made before, and for some reason I kept saying these are 16-inch blocks finished. They're 15-inch blocks finished, but in my head I had 16 inches, and so this is 32 inches finished, which means that when I put two of these blocks on, let's just pin these up here temporarily, and I brought two. They're not going to fit. I'm going to be short 2 inches because each one of these is an inch smaller than I drafted this for. So I'm just going to put some sashing in to make up the difference to lay out the final quilt, and I may do another video on that layout. But this video is just about the drafting and making of this medallion. I hope you'll join me. Let's get started. So again, this is the sketch in my notepad. So you'll see me referring to that several times. I like to use freezer paper to draw my patterns. It is 18 inches wide, and I can pull up a piece as long as I need. We're going to be working a 16-inch block finished, which will be drawn 16.5, so 18 inches is perfect. And I'm going to start by drawing that 16-inch block and the 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around. That will make it the 16.5 inches cut. So that's what you see me doing here, and you really want to take your time and make sure that this is square. So you see I've got all 4 sides, and now what I'm doing is I'm using the 45-degree angle on my ruler, and I'm measuring the diagonal from the top left to the bottom right, and then I'm going to measure the angle from the bottom left to the top right and make sure those numbers are the same. Also using the 45-degree line on my ruler, and that makes sure that I am absolutely square before I even get started. Here I'm counting the blocks that I used in my notepad, and I like to use a gridded notepad for designs because it makes things a little easier. Unfortunately, my design is 9 units wide, which doesn't multiply evenly into a 16-inch quadrant, so I had to subtract an inch, and what I decided to do was to keep my Lemoyne Star the same size and the band around it, which is 1.5 inches, and then I started from the outside. I wanted a 1-inch buffer around the outside of the medallion, and the outside ring to also be 1.5 inches, and so I just used what was left to do those sun rays, I'll call them. Now that I have my numbers all calculated, I need to start marking them. and I'm marking my stitch lines at the 6-inch mark, the 7.5-inch mark, the 13.5-inch mark, and the 15-inch mark. And I'm marking those on the x-axis and the y-axis. And then I'm also marking where the seam allowances will be for my cutting instructions. So along with the 6-inch, 7.5, 13.5, and 15.5-inch marks, I'm going to mark 1/4 inch on either side of those. So 5 3/4 and 6 1/4 will go around the 6-inch mark, 7 1/4, 7 3/4 around the 7.5-inch mark, 13 1/4, 13 3/4 around the 13.5-inch mark, 14 3/4 and 15 1/4 around the 15-inch mark is how all these will be marked. So once I get them marked on the X and the Y axis, I went in, drew a 45-degree angle. So at this point, my 0, 0 is on the bottom left, and I marked all those measurements, well, at least the stitch line measurements on that 45-degree line, so that I could make sure that as I drew my curves, I was hitting my marks. So that's what I'm doing here. Once I get most of my measurements marked, I'm ready to start drawing my curves. So I get my giant compass out and make sure that when you draw your compass that you're using the 0, 0 line, that is your stitch line for the block, and not the seam allowance line, that's the 1/4 inch further out. And here I'm drawing my first arc, which is at the 6-inch mark. And I'm trying to be very careful to get the measurement right on the compass, and I'll check it at the X, the Y, and the 45-degree angle to make sure that I'm on track, and then I will start drawing the curves. I will be doing more medallion patterns later, and the next one I do, I will show you how to create a tool to draw your arcs using thin cardboard like a cereal box or something, and it will make your life much easier. You won't have to purchase a giant compass like this, and you'll be able to make as many curves as you like. So the next one I'll make sure to do that. In this case, unfortunately, I was using a mechanical pencil and it was giving me the hardest time. I was not able to keep the lead consistently out. I hadn't drawn my seam allowances, so that's what I'm drawing here, those 1/4 inch lines on either side of that first arc measurement, which is 6 inches. So I'm making sure that I have them at the next locations as well. And I'm just going to speed this up to 6 times speed because it's a little tedious. If you're interested in seeing it a little slower for the details, just decrease your speed by half. And but for everyone else, you probably just want to get through this, so I've sped it up. So here I'm doing the 13.5-inch stitch line, now the 13 1/4 inch seam allowance line, which wasn't quite right. I'm going to have to go back in and fix that. The 13 3/4 inch seam allowance line. So I'm going back in and making that adjustment. This is the 15-inch line, the 14 3/4 inch line, and the 15 1/4 inch line, arc, I should say. And then I'm going back to get that 7.5-inch stitch line, the 7 1/4 inch seam allowance line, and the 7 3/4 inch seam allowance line. Now I'm drawing a 45-degree angle so that I can sketch in my Lemoyne Star. The Lemoyne Star I did not do as a paper piece pattern. I just did it as a conventional pattern with Y seams that measured 12.5 inches cut, which is 12 inches finished, and then I just used the circle that I made using this pattern as a template to center that star and then cut the excess off. So the rest of the pattern is paper piece, but that center part is conventionally pieced, just so you know. Here I'm using my compass to divide my angles in half. So I've divided 45 in half for 22.5-degree angles, and then I divide those in half for 11.25-degree angles. If you're interested in seeing that for like the math side of this, I would love to show you. I just don't want to bore people who aren't interested. But if you're interested, let me know in the comments below and I will show that to you. I'm sure it would make my geometry teacher very proud that I still use that as an adult. So back to the design. Make sure that you draw your design to the stitch lines so that your points come together properly. Or if you want a floating point, if you don't want to risk cutting off your points, then make your points a little short of the stitch line, and that'll give you a safe area to work. So referring to my design again, I'm trying to figure out how I want to do these corner stars, and I start to draw them in, and then I decide that I want them to have a kind of a twisted effect, a woven effect, if you will. And I didn't know quite how pointy I wanted that leg of the star to be, so you're going to see it change a few times over the course of drawing this. I decided to give it a break and work on the diamonds, and then I went back to the star later. Here I'm just trying to get the stars placed so they're symmetrical on either side of the design, and then I have to figure out how to piece it in the paper piece pattern. So I spend a little time there making sure those diamonds are going to be equal. Then after I get everything where I want it to be, I take a marker to darken all of my lines. Normally I wouldn't use such a thick marker, but I wanted to make sure you'd be able to see it on camera. So I'm using a rather thick Sharpie to go over my lines. On the inside of the block, I'm marking the stitch lines with a solid line and the seam allowance lines with a dotted line, which is kind of opposite of what you would normally do. But it's more important for me to see those stitch lines clearly. So on this part of the pattern making process. But do what works best for you. When I mark the outside of this quadrant of the medallion, I'm going to go back to conventional marking, which is I'm going to mark the cut line as a solid line and the stitch line as a dotted line, just for the outline of the block. And again, this is just one quadrant, so it's 16 inches, but the whole design is going to end up 32 inches. Finished. All right, after I get everything marked and all of my seam allowances marked, then I'm going to do it kind of fast here, but I'm going to go in and I'm going to mark the sequence for my paper piece patterns. Those little arrows that I just marked, I want my rings to go in opposite directions so that they sort of nest, and it does help me when I put it together. That outer ring, I will say I should have marked that the sequence is correct, but I should have started with a large segment of the piece and not a small segment of the piece. Here I've come in with a second piece of freezer paper and I've pinned it to the piece that I have the design on, and you can kind of see it through the freezer paper. And I am tracing each individual piece of the pattern here. So here I'm starting with the circle that's I'm going to use to cut out the Lemoyne Star. And I'm using my compass to get a accurate curve, but I abandon that later and I just freehand trace over the curves. So again, do what works best for you. When I show you how to make the tool on the next medallion, you can just use that again and it'll make your life easier. So here I'm working on that inside ring. And I know the size of it already, so I'm just marking it using the compass first, and then I'm going to put it on top of the location on the pattern that I've drawn already to actually trace the design. So I'm going to take those pins out. I'm going to move it over so it's placed over the ring, which you can see there through the paper. If you have a hard time seeing through the paper, then you can put this on a window. Pin your design up on, just a window on a sunny day, or if you have a light box, and then that will make your life easier. Here, I decided not to have seams in my cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west. So I moved the pattern to the opposite end and extended the next piece out so that I would have seamless curves within the same piece of fabric, if you know what I mean. So here I'm just tracing by hand the curve. I have my pieces of paper pinned together so that they move as one. And then I use my ruler for the straight pieces. And I'm going to do the same thing I did with that inner curve. After I get this all traced out, I'm going to reposition it so that one edge meets what would be the next piece. I'm lining up my stitch lines, and then I'm drawing the next piece onto this part of the pattern. I'm going to erase the original stitch line and seam line, and then I'll clean it up on the other end as well. This is the piece where I was talking about. See how I have it numbered with 1 being that tiny triangle there, and then 2, 3, 4. I should have started with the large section, still numbering to the left, but that way it would grip better on my pattern since I'm using freezer paper for my paper piece pattern. Here I'm just making sure that my left and right pieces match up well after I have them traced. So after that, it's time to cut out my pieces. These are the pieces I'm going to use to paper piece. I'm just going to use them 4 times each, and starting with my folds. If you watch my other paper piece patterns, you know that I do fold in advance when using freezer paper. I think it's very important, though you don't have to do it. I highly recommend it. So I'm going to go ahead and fold all of my pieces. I fold them all towards the shiny side of the freezer paper first, and then I go in and make the crease more pronounced on the dull side. So here we are starting with our Lemoyne Star, and I'm cutting diamonds that are 2 3/4 inch. Now I'm taking a pencil and I'm going in and I'm marking 1/4 inch from each side, which will give me an X in each corner, which will show me exactly where I need to start and stop my stitch line. I'm making my Lemoyne Star using Y seams, so for me it's easiest if I have these marks that I can see, and I'm pairing each of the 4 quadrants of the Lemoyne Star. So the fabrics that I'm using are like a pink color and then a red color for the star. So once I get the pinks marked, I pair it with a red. I'm going to be sewing them all with the pink on the top, and that way I know that I keep my alternating in the correct sequence. So we're going to slow this down to watch how I sew it together. And I use my hand wheel to get the needle in the correct position. Sorry for bumping the camera there. I want to make sure that the needle goes right down in the X, and you can see the X near my hands before I start. I want to stitch forward a couple stitches and then stitch backwards the same number of stitches or less. Then I'm going to sew and I'm going to stop right in that bottom X, and I'm going to back tack as well. And I'm going to do that with all 4 quadrants of the Lemoyne Star. So I have 4 pairs of diamonds here. Using the hand wheel to put the needle right down in the X formed by drawing a 1/4 inch from each side of the diamond. Back tack, stitch until you hit the center of the X in the next corner, back tack. So I've got 2 more to do, and they're all done the same way. I didn't record the sound at the sewing machine. I don't know if that's annoying or not. I kind of like to hear the sewing machine, but you let me know what you think in the comments below, whether or not you want to hear it or not. Okay, so here's my last back tack, and now we're going to take it to the ironing board, and we're going to prepare each of these 4 sections for their first Y seam. I cut 2 squares that are 5.5 inches and cut those into 4 triangles, and now I'm marking them at the top of the triangle 1/4 of an inch from each of those sides so that I know where to stop stitching. Well, where to pin actually, and I'm pinning right in my seam allowance at the 1/4 inch mark where that triangle would fit into the space. My seam allowance is finger pressed to the pink side. I just have the 1 pin in, and I'm lining it up with the edge of my 1/4 inch foot, and I'm going to sew until I reach the pin, which is where the stitches are. Then I'm going to remove the pin, and I'm going to rotate my fabric around and align the new stitch line, which is on the 90 degrees from the first side on that triangle. I hope that makes sense. My seam allowance there between the 2 diamonds, I'm just letting lay down so it's toward the pink still. And from here, I'm just going to sew off the edge, and I'm going to do all 4 pairs of diamonds the same way. I'm going to pin it where the stitches stop on the pair of diamonds. Then I'm going to stick that pin through the X I made on the triangle, and I'm just going to keep that pin vertical until I get my 2 side seams, the first side that I'm going to sew, aligned. Once I get that first side aligned, then I usually feel comfortable tipping my pin over, and I take a small bite with the pin, then I take it to the sewing machine. So one more time, I finger press toward the pink diamond. I already have pencil marks where the 1/4 inch is inside that V, so I stick the pin right through the X. Then I stick it through the X that I marked on the background triangle, and I leave the pin just straight up and down while I align the first sewing edge. Once I get that aligned, I tip the pin and just take a small bite and take it to the sewing machine. We're going to start right off the edge of the background piece, and we're going to stitch until we reach the stitch line between the diamonds. We're going to remove our pin, and then we're going to rotate our diamond fabric around so that the sewing edge lines up with the other side of the triangle. Once everything's lined up, then we just sew down that edge and off. Nope, I have one more to do. So you can see it one more time. Sew until I reach the stitch line, which is where that pin is. Remove the pin. Rotate my fabric until the next side aligns. Make sure you pull all that fabric out of the way. You don't want that to get under the needle again. Notice I did not back tack and my needle is down. So I could just rotate it around the needle. And then I sew off the edge. Now it's time for some pressing. I'm spritzing everything with water, laying it flat with my hands first, and then hitting it with the iron. After everything is nice and flat, I will trim it down to size. And I'm just following the sides of the diamonds. You're working with some biased edges there, so be careful not to stretch anything. Next, I'm going to pair these sections that I've created, and between the pairs, I'm going to add more triangles. So it's going to be the same as what we've already done, but now we're doing the halves. So whenever you're putting the diamonds together, remember that you want to start at that 1/4 inch X, back tack a little bit, and then forward to the next X, back tack again. So I'm going to stop right here where those seams come together, and they are nested there in the center because all of our seam allowances are going in the same direction toward the pink at this point. Let's get the other side. I'm nesting those points at the center of the star, putting a pin in there, and then I'm lining up the sides, and I'm going to make sure that I start right at that X. Use the hand wheel to get my needle right in the middle of that X. Take a few stitches forward, back tack, and then forward to the next X, which is at the stitch line, back tack, and now to the ironing board. So I think I just finger press these. But what you want is for all of your seam allowances to go in the same direction. So our first ones are going clockwise, so we want to press this clockwise as well. That little spot you see on the background fabric is just some water from my spray bottle. I'm marking these larger triangles the same way I did the smaller background triangles. We're going to pin right into the V between the diamonds, just like we did before. We're going to use that pin once we put it through the end of the stitch line in the diamonds and put it through the X here on these triangles. So same thing we've already done. Now we're going to line up our first stitch side with the pin just sticking straight out so that the fabric can pivot around freely. And then once it's lined up, we'll tip that pin over and take a small bite, and that piece is ready to sew. We'll do the same thing with this piece, keeping the seam allowances going clockwise. Sometimes I gotta fiddle with it a little bit and get my brain right. and get things oriented before I put the pin in. Okay, getting those sides aligned, tipping over my pin. So we're sewing a background piece on, so we're going to start right off the edge. And we're going to sew until we reach, I did back tack, we're going to sew until we reach the stitch line between the diamonds, which is where our pin should be. We're going to stop, we're not back tacking or anything, we're just going to pivot around that needle that's down. We're going to rotate our fabric on top until it's aligned with the triangle on the bottom. We're going to sew right off. Same thing with the second side. Stopping right at that pin where the stitch line is between the diamonds. Rotating all of the fabric around so that the edges meet. Our seam allowance is going to lay right down. And then we're going to sew. We're going to sew to the end of the background fabrics and back tack if you like. Alright, so let's go back to the ironing board and see what we have. So I'm starting with a spritz of water because I want to get those seam allowances in the correct direction. And the spritz of water helps to relax it. So that seam between the diamonds is going to the right, and the piece that we just added in is going to lay open. So if you have any threads or anything sticking out there, go ahead and get those cleaned up as you go. And let's go ahead and speed this up while I do the second half. When we put the first and second halves together, it's going to be the same as what we've already done. We're going to nest the centers, sew from X to X because we're going to be working with sewing diamonds to diamonds again, and then we will insert our last two background triangles. So, warp speed. So I'm going to get this ironed up the same as the other section, and then we're going to pin these together at the centers where the seams come together. So I like to stick my pin straight through and then kind of tilt the pin over a little bit. And I make a small bite, take a small bite with my pin. Then I'm going to line up my sides and just sew that straight edge. Again, we're starting and stopping at the X's so that you have a little bit open for this Y seam insertion. Notice that I have spiraled my seams in the middle, so all of my seams are going clockwise. I've pinned that second, or actually it's the third triangle, the way I did the first and second. And we're going to do the same things we did before. We're going to stitch to the seam line, keep our needle down, raise our presser foot, rotate our seam allowance around, It's going to be a little bit more difficult to get all your fabric out of the way because you have twice as much fabric there now, but it's not a big deal. Just be patient with yourself. That seam allowance that is in the kind of the crotch area of the star there will lay right down because they're all in the same direction. So as long as you follow those ironing directions, you should not have a problem with your seam allowances getting in the way. Okay, and this is our last Y seam for our Lemoyne Star, same as the others. So you'll get the hang of it. Just have a little confidence in yourself, and if it gets messed up, it's fine. Just keep it moving. Keep it moving. If you have to remove some stitches, that's fine too. We all have to pick on occasion, okay? So believe in yourself. So I used my cut circle just as a template, and I'm trying to line it up with my sketch so that I can cut the circle. I will say, see how you can see that white paper around the edge? I cut this circle too large, and I don't know how I did it, but it was better to cut it too large than to cut it too small. So when I sew the next ring onto this center Lemoyne Star circle, it's actually going to be too big, but I just bring it in and it works out. So now I'm pre-cutting my pieces for the raise ring, and that is not the next ring in the sequence, but the reason I'm doing this one first is because it uses the largest pieces of fabric, and I like to try to use my scrap fabric on pieces that are smaller if I can. So I like to start with my bigger paper pieced pattern pieces before I work on the ones that have smaller sections. So I tackled these triangles in two different ways. The rays are smaller triangles, and they're small enough that I felt comfortable just making rectangles and then cutting them on the diagonal. That is at least 3/8 of an inch bigger than what I need, but I usually go half an inch, sometimes an inch larger than what I need, just so that I have some wiggle room. So I've got my first two sides started on my freezer paper. Make sure that you iron on the paper side after you iron down on the shiny side, on the fabric side. When you do iron on the fabric side, be careful not to touch your iron to the shiny side of the freezer paper. See, I'm trying to be careful there not to touch my iron to that shiny side of the freezer paper because it will leave film on your iron. But you also need to make sure that you flip it over and iron on the paper side so that you get good adhesion of your fabric to the freezer paper. And you see this goes very easily. Once my pieces are pre-cut, it's, just kind of repeating unless you make a mistake like I did and let your piece get folded underneath there. So I have to do that one twice. But again, not a big deal. And because I'm using freezer paper, I only had to make one section each from the quadrant because I can use this over again. So this is my this is my first time using this section of the pattern, and then I end up using it 4 more times for the other 4 quadrants. For the ring that's outside of this one with the dark brown, I used that one 8 times and it works just fine. So freezer paper is the way to go in my opinion. I don't have a bunch of extra waste. So in this example here, I'm cutting freehand. You may not feel comfortable using a rotary cutter to cut freehand on your curves. So in the next piece that I'm going to show you, I'll show you how I cut using the ruler, cut a curve using the ruler. So I moved to the corner pieces so that I could, again, use the biggest pieces first because I have a lot of background on these pieces. And what I'm explaining here is that I alternate my colorways from corner to corner, and I wrote those, the fabrics that I wanted to use on the pattern for 2 of the corners, and then I just knew they would be the opposite when I did the other 2 corners. So I'm adding my first 2 diamonds, and then I cut a few pieces to do the number 2 and number 3 pieces on the diamonds. And look at where I'm having to place this because of the diagonal. So you want to be careful. You can see the shape that you want to cover when you have it folded, and that really helps you to place your fabric. I'll have many more paper piecing videos in the future because that's kind of my jam. So I didn't want to take a lot of time explaining it here. Even though I did when I recorded it, it ended up being like almost 5 hours of video. So we're going to do this quickly so we can get everything in, but know that there will be more videos in the future where I will focus on either the drafting or the paper piecing. So if you have questions, please feel free to leave them below, and I will answer them and try to get them in a video in the future for you. Okay? So here I'm pre-cutting pieces. Since it's mirrored and my fabric is dual-sided, it's a solid fabric, I'm just able to cut a matching piece for the other side. And again, notice how I'm trying not to touch the back of the freezer paper with my iron. I just use the tip of the iron. I'm checking that the piece will fit with the paper folded. Notice how I iron the fabric side first and then always go back and iron the paper side so that everything will stick. So I know this piece looks really wild, but here's where I get to cutting using the ruler, including cutting the curved side. So I start and just rotate the ruler and follow the blade with the rotation of the ruler. So I have a little notch on that piece. I'm flipping this last part of the seam allowance on one side so that those points on the star will nest and I can get a good alignment for these pieces. All right, and it turned out pretty nice. So again, I've got to do this 3 more times. This is the outside ring, and the thing that I wish I had done differently is that I started my number 1 on the right hand side, which is what I wanted to do, but I should have started it with the larger piece of fabric and not such a small piece of fabric because it has a hard time staying on the freezer paper. So for these iterations, I sewed the number 2 piece like it was the number 1 piece, and then sewed the 1 and 2 pieces onto the edges and flipped the seam allowance right there so that all my seam allowance would go in the correct direction. So if I were to draft this to sell, I would have my number 1 piece be the larger piece and not the tiny piece. But these came together really quickly because I pre-cut my pieces again. And this is 1/8 of a quadrant, or a half of a quadrant, I should say, 1/8 of the circle. So I had to make 2 of these per quadrant. Also, it was more wear and tear on my paper piece pattern. So I make sure I get it cleaned up so that I can get the full use out of it, and I had no problem. So here I'm drawing 1/4 inch from the edge on all of these pieces so that when I sew them together, I can get them aligned correctly. And aligned correctly is where my drawn line touches the edge of the piece I'm sewing into. And it gives me the right dog ears. I'm doing the same thing here, and this piece I've got my 3rd piece of this ring going together. Actually, I'm finishing the ring here. So I sewed two pieces together, and then I'm sewing those pairs together to finish the ring. And those lines really help me to get my dog ears correct. So sorry I didn't piece this one. I don't have the video for me piecing that. But here, what I'm trying to do is show you how I pin it. Now, I use a lot of pins when I'm sewing curves, and it helps me immensely. And I use folding where I don't have a specific point in the design that I can identify as center. So you see me folding these pieces so I can match up center folds and get all of my pins in the correct place. And I start at the 4 cardinal points, and then I divide those in 2 and then in 2 again. I have the concave piece on top, and I'm not stretching it, but I just pull it out to meet the edge of my circle on the bottom. Now, full disclosure, like I said earlier, I cut that center circle with the Lemoyne Star too large, and I had to do this again. But I ripped the seams and then repositioned it, so I had to sew it again. I didn't make the pieces again. But this is the process, and it's actually fairly simple, and I finally got it nice and flat after I had messed it up the first time. And you can see my seam allowance there. I had like an extra 1/4 inch all the way around, and so I just brought the seam in, pinned it in a 1/4 of an inch, and it worked out fine. So here I've got my rays, and this is not sewn together. I just have those pieces lying on top of one another to check that I have a 1/2 of an inch overlap. So if you give yourself that check before you sew it together, it will help a lot. Here's it all pinned. I have it nice and swirled, and see all my pins in the center? That's so that it will be easier for me to sew at the machine. I'm just going to basically be moving a pizza through there. And it's the same as with all the other curves. I'm just going to pull the concave side out to the convex piece and make sure that I don't get any folds in there, any pinches. And because I work, at the cardinal points and then divide until I feel like I have enough pins, it works out pretty well. And I'm saying that in contrast to just pinning around the circle. I divide it into 4, then into 8, then into 16, 32, whatever needs to be done there. So, and it worked out so well. Like I was so happy when I unfolded this, especially after having to redo the inside. And I didn't need to make any marks there because the design, you can see where the rays meet that inner circle, and the way my seam allowances are, the way I drafted it, you can see I'm actually nesting those little red parts of this ring with the rays because the seam allowances go in opposite directions. Made it super easy to get this lined up. And again, it just worked. I was very happy with the way it just laid down. I did not clip my seams. They're all pressed to the outside. It just worked out. So unfortunately, I did not capture my overhead camera putting together the corners, but I sewed all the corners together just like any other ring. And this is me attaching it to the outermost ring of the circle the exact same way. I just pinned it at the points where I thought it needed to be pinned, and then I ease it out to match the edges of the fabric, making sure I don't get any folds in there as I go. So I'm adjusting the fabric so that it stays smooth at the edge where I'm stitching. And again, this was another one that it just worked out for me. Sometimes it won't. Sometimes something doesn't go right. But if you divide it up, use lots of pins, make sure that the concave side is on the top, it should work out for you. So this is my finished block, my finished medallion. I was very happy with it. All the seams are pressed to the outside. Remember that I made this to go with my Open Diamonds block. This is the Open Diamonds block. I'll make sure that I link that down below, and it'll also be at the end of this video. And I'll put all these in a group as well, on a watch list. But these were smaller than I expected, so I ended up needing to make a spacer for the design that I wanted to put together to finish my quilt. So I ended up making these Seminole blocks to go at the cardinal points around my center medallion, with 2 inches of sashing around the medallion. And this is how the finished quilt turned out. I'm very happy with it. Well, it's the finished quilt top. I also added 4.5 inches of fabric at the top, and then another 2.5-inch strip beyond that after the sashing, and to make it rectangular, and I like it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that you will give drafting your own medallion a try. This was probably a complex one for a first try. I would suggest maybe doing an 8-inch medallion and see how you like it. Get yourself some freezer paper, get your pencils out. Oh, I do need to show you how to make that tool, which I will do in the next how to draft a medallion video, which will just be the drafting part, not the sewing part. But I hope you will come back. My next video, I think it's going to be a Bargello craft project. So I hope you'll come back and join me. Thank you so much if you made it to the end of the video. Your likes and subscriptions are so very much appreciated. Have a wonderful holiday season.